Tensions between Beijing and Washington are again on the increase. The U.S. aircraft carrier and strike group has returned to the South China Sea amid a planned trip by the U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to Chinese Taipei. Is this a signal that there will be some kind of military confrontation? In this edition of the Spotlight, we will look at why the U.S. is after provoking China while it is involved in other military activities like the one in Ukraine. Our guests for this edition of the Spotlight are geopolitical analyst Peter Koenig joins us from Geneva. Also joining us, activist and commentator Don DeBar, who joins us from Westchester, New York. Welcome to you both. Don DeBar, I'll first start with you. So what do we have? A U.S. aircraft carrier redeployed to the South China Sea. The U.S., the way it's reported, wants to show off its muscles. And China says we can clearly see who is the biggest threat to peace and stability in the South China Sea and Asia. How do you read things right now?
Well, the reality is, first of all, this is a change in U.S. policy towards China and Taiwan. The U.S. has declared that it recognizes that Taiwan is part of China. There's been a one China policy in place for decades now. And this is, in fact, if not de jure, an abrogation of that acknowledgement. You have to consider, let's dip a little bit into Robert S. McNamara's wisdom on the question of empathy in international relations, as odd a source as that might be for someone with so many deaths on their hands. You have to look at the situation through the eyes of the party on the other side of the table. Let's say that something, Second Amendment or whatever, triggers a reaction in a state like Texas, and Texas decides that it's going to secede from the United States, as this has happened, as a matter of fact, in 1861, as we know, and it resulted in a civil war. Suppose, though, that China decided to recognize, in one fashion or another, Texas, to send hundreds of millions of dollars worth of armaments to Texas and troops to train Texans to fight the U.S. government. And that Texas, for example, was also making a relationship with Mexico, which used to be part of Mexico, and that the Chinese Navy was now in the Gulf of California and the Gulf of Mexico on maneuvers testing the right of navigation in those areas, their rights over the high seas that the U.S. declares in the South China Sea. What exactly would be Washington's response when suddenly Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, drops himself off in Austin for a meeting with the governor and about to be president of Texas?
Sounds good. Well, that is a plan for China, Peter Koenig. So why is it that the U.S. feels it can do that and China perhaps maybe not?
Sorry?
Well, I mean, that sounds like a plan. That sounds like something that's a great comparison to put things into perspective. So why does the U.S. feel that it can muscle itself in that way?
Absolutely. I fully agree with it. I think this is hilarious. And I would just simply, I have nothing to add to this plan. It is excellent. I would just maybe, hold a second. I would just like to add to this plan that China might also want to send one of their Navy ships, warships, to confront New York, and see how would the U.S. react to that. Besides, excuse me.
Okay.
No, let me finish. Yes, and besides, this is of course to be more serious. If Madame Pelosi travels to Taiwan against the will of Beijing, she is in full breach of legal entry.
Let me ask you: do you think she's going to go through with that plan? She's going to go actually visit?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the U.S. under Biden is capable of doing just about anything. I hope not. But in the U.S., such an illegal entry would would be punishable by jail. So, I mean, China could in fact do the same thing. But I still doubt that she will do that, and I still hope that it will. This is just a lot of hot air and not going to be anything conflictuous, which may even end up into a war. So this is my approach to it. I think there should be more countries doing to the U.S. what the U.S. is doing to them,
Sure.
namely confront them. And this is the same applies to Russia. They could put up military bases in Mexico, and what would the U.S. do? So yeah, I think this is this is the first assessment.
All right. Well, Don DeBar, let's take a look at some of the Chinese statements. The one I picked here was, if the U.S. insists on taking its own course, the Chinese military will never sit idly by. That is the Chinese defense minister talking there. But add to that the phone call that everybody was waiting for to see what's going to come out of it, of which what came out of it is those who play with fire will only get burnt. That's what the Chinese president told Joe Biden. So if we're looking at these types of statements, what is your reading into whether Pelosi is going to go ahead with this trip or not? And if so, the Chinese response?
Well, my colleague in Geneva asked to be serious for a moment. I'm going to slide out of that just for a second. The image I have is of Slim Pickens in a Stanley Kubrick movie about the Third World War, where he jumps out of a B-52 bomber on top of a bomb to someplace inside the Soviet Union. Maybe Pelosi will instead go down without the bomb with a little nudge from somebody on board the plane. Seriously, the U.S. military, the Pentagon said they're preparing a military defense for her. In other words, there's going to be some sort of a military action taken inside China, because Taiwan is inside China, by the United States against the wishes and certainly without the permission of the Chinese government, in order to protect, as part of the security, quote unquote, for Pelosi, who is going there without the invitation of the Chinese government. I mean, that is itself per se an act of war. So in terms of the statements coming out of China, honestly, I think they're rather tame and diplomatic and subdued, because outright, clearly, they could basically say this is an act of war and be correct under international law and certainly under practice.
So when the Chinese president says if you play with fire, you're going to get burnt, what kind of burning does he mean?
Well, you have napalm, you have phosphorus, you have U-238 and a variety of reactions that come off of that. I don't know what the hell they make neutron bombs out of, and they have everything else in the world that they can throw at it that burns and or causes death and pain. We're talking about two powers that are able basically to have a war that could consume most of our species. And for some reason, whoever's really running the show in Washington is obviously not Biden. Whoever's programming that teleprompter and setting policy for the Pentagon and the CIA and whatever, those people are already on the precipice of World War III over Ukraine. I mean, I don't know how much clearer the Russian government could be about it. The Russian government has at its disposal nuclear weapons that are purposed for one of two reasons that I can think of. One, we know, was mutually assured destruction. In other words, if you make a nuclear attack on us, we will retaliate, and consequently, that keeps you from doing it. The question is, does the Russian government consider an existential threat to Russia's sovereignty, to taking down the Russian government, which Biden has said several times is his goal, and dismantling the Russian state, which the CIA, some people in the State Department, and of course the people in Ukraine have all said is what needs to be done? Will they use those nuclear weapons to stop that? And so as the U.S. keeps rolling weapons into Ukraine, while this whole drama in China is taking place, they're setting the stage for Russia to have no alternative, perhaps. If they succeed in what they're attempting to do with billions of dollars, Russia has to strike back, and that's all they got.
Peter Koenig, what do you think? Do you think that, since we're talking about Russia, or guests talking about Russia there, that perhaps the U.S. may use the Russia card here, because the U.S. has issued a warning to China in the form of sanctions, stop buying Russian oil, because the way it sees it is bankrolling Russia? Do you think that, therefore, this planned trip by Pelosi could maybe have that as an underlying reason for the U.S. to want to react in the way that it is when we're seeing this huge carrier move into the area?
Yes, no, I don't think so. I think those who call the shots in the U.S. know very, very clearly that sanctioning China doesn't mean anything. It's just propaganda for those people who have no idea what China has been doing in the past and what China is up to. But those who call the shots in the U.S. know it. So it's, again, I'd call it off there, because, and even if there would be more sanctions put on China, first of all, they have no effect because simply China has separated itself pretty much from the West in more ways than one. And one of the ways, which is very, very important, and I think the Western media really don't cover it well enough, is this Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP, the world's largest trade agreement that they have recently signed, or actually went into effect on January 1st of this year. This is an ASEAN countries trade agreement with the 10 ASEAN countries plus China, Japan, Australia, South Korea, and New Zealand. So 15 countries. These countries in the next 2 or 3 years are expected to account for about 30% of the world trade. And this has nothing to do with the US or with Europe. It doesn't even deal with these currency. It deals with local currency and with the conglomerate of local currencies, and particularly with the Chinese digital yen, international trading yen, that will probably later this year or early next year come into effect. So I don't think that any of these threats or by the US will have any effect on China. And in fact, I think what China might very well do, it's something very simple. If Pelosi indeed goes to Taiwan, they could arrest her there. That's as simple as that.
They can do what?
They could arrest her in Taiwan. Taiwan is part of mainland China, so it's part of China. So they have certainly their people who could arrest her in Taiwan.
Yeah, if that happens, I'd like to see Trump's reaction. Okay, the RCEP, as our guest there, Don DeBar, mentioned, is the biggest trading bloc, and the ASEAN countries are part of that. And my question to you, Don DeBar, is the fact that China says that the way that the U.S. has described the South China Sea and approached it as a dispute is a complete distortion of the truth. And China says that this is a home to regional countries. We do business, and they all want peace and stability there. And of course, ASEAN countries are part of that. Do you think that when you look at ASEAN countries and what's happening in terms of the friction between the U.S. and China, that they are on board with the U.S., or are they on board with China, given that context that our guest there from Geneva said in terms of the RCEP, for example?
I think he laid it out very accurately, and it was a clever presentation of it that gets one to understand the essence of what's happening. The trend is away from Europe and North America and towards Eurasia. China at the center of it, Russia as a strategic partner, both in terms of resources and in terms of high-tech weaponry and other technology. And all along the Belt and Road, the ASEAN countries, the bridge to Africa, we were seeing Russia also working that this week. What you're talking about, in essence, is sort of nulling the previous conditions, economic conditions that existed, where you had essentially to have the U.S. as a broker, as the colonial power, as the guarantor of transportation across the seas of raw materials in and products out of China, and the games that the U.S. has been playing in the South China Sea, for example, and also in Korea and Sri Lanka to a degree, and whatever, that's all reflected. What China is doing is nulling it. That you have the overland routes that are being developed, the high-speed rail, and all of that. You've got, as I said, the Belt and Road project and the String of Pearls. There's all these places where the U.S. has no role. And the strategic partnership with Russia provides an awful lot of the raw materials. So let's say that there is some sort of a real serious sanctions war between China and the United States. China will stop sending all of the goods that we use, TV sets, cars, toothbrushes, chopped chicken, whatever else they send us, and they'll keep it, and we get lawyers, accountants, and ad people, because that's pretty much what we produce, and of course some sort of animal manure that we can't really say on television. China is preparing itself for the world that the United States is sanctioning away, to have its own economic bloc that doesn't require the United States, and it's going to leave the United States impoverished and on the periphery of world activity if the U.S. continues its present policies. And the U.S. is an active partner in that project with the policies that they're doing, attacking Russia and China at the same time being only one of the most obvious pieces of evidence of that.
Well, geographically speaking, when we take a look at the South China Sea, Peter Koenig, 30% of the global maritime crude oil actually of trade goes through that South China Sea corridor, in a sense. So if I'm thinking out loud here, if you have U.S. telling China stop buying Russian crude, which passes through there, along with the fact that 30% of the trade happens in that area, in that South China Sea, and you have the USS Ronald Reagan carrier there, is the U.S. then trying to maybe create a conflict there so that closes down in order to impact China? I'm thinking out loud. What do you think of a possibility of that scenario maybe going through the U.S.'s generals' heads?
I also think this is kind of ludicrous, because Russia has different other means of sending its crude to China other than through the South China Sea. Besides the South China Sea, which is probably at one point, I don't know exactly what the percentage that is the case now, but at one point, I think under Obama and still later on, about 50 or 60% of the U.S. Navy was stationed in the South China Sea. And I'm sure the Ronald Reagan boat vessel is not the only one that is right now in the South China Sea. So there's a lot of American armory stationed in the South China Sea that could try to intervene. But again, I don't think they would dare it, because it could escalate to a world war. And in any war that China would be involved, serious war that China would be involved, you could count on Russia to be a serious ally of China. And as President Putin has said on many occasions, out of a nuclear war, there would be no winner. And I don't think the U.S. seriously, those who call the shots, they know that, and they don't want to go that far. So I don't believe that they would interfere with that trade of 30% going through the South China Sea. Besides, there's this is still an international territory. This still doesn't belong it belongs to everybody. So China has a right to defend itself and to defend it also, and they would. So I don't think this is an issue at this point. It's again, there's a lot of propaganda, and now when we are already, the world is saturated with anti-Russia propaganda, thanks to the war in Ukraine. This is just adding more propaganda against China, which we are vulnerable, especially in the hot Western summer, where people are on vacation and believe everything the media say. This is a propaganda game, and I don't think there's more behind it than that.
Well, we know that there's lots of issues that the U.S. and China have, or should I say that the U.S. has with China, many of them.
Yes, that's true.
Don DeBar, President Joe Biden actually issued a warning recently to President Xi, saying there's going to be unspecified consequences if you continue buying Russian oil. I don't want to keep harping on the Russia issue here, but Biden sees that that is generating revenue for Russia, and he has even said that maybe you're helping Moscow evade sanctions. What kind of unintended consequences do you think Biden means? Do you think it just goes as far as maybe punishing Russia or China by having it restrict access to the Western markets, or are we talking something perhaps a little bit bigger than that?
Yeah, I think we're risking something a lot bigger. China uses an awful lot of energy. There's 1.5 billion people, in essence, more or less. They are in the process of constructing the 21st century economy. They're well along the way to do that. There's 5 times or more as many people there that once they reach across the board the standard of living that Western Europe and the United States have, their energy consumption would probably be even more than it is now. To attempt to essentially choke off their blood supply to the economy, to stop them from constructing the project that they're working on furiously, is an existential threat to the society. It's intended to be that, by the way. The purpose of imposing sanctions is to create unrest in the target country, to enable regime change at the direction of the people imposing the sanctions, the United States, whatever. China's not going to sit still for that. The first thing that they can do is sanction the United States. Again, the economies are pretty much on par, but when one looks at the actual economic, in the United States, if the banks burned all the bonds and stocks or whatever, there'd be some sort of paperwork problem and panics and all of that, and people's bank balances would look messed up or whatever. If China cuts off what it has, which are factories that produce the goods that we use to live and enjoy our lives on, there's a real material effect of that, and that can happen immediately. Whatever ships are in their ports stay there, and they don't send anymore. So that's what the U.S. is risking at a minimum. And if really what they're doing is trying to target existentially the governments of China and Russia at the same time by imposing these sanctions to interrupt this commerce that's a regular part of both of their economies now, they're going to find themselves looking at two nations with nuclear weapons, modern technology,
sure.
One with a 500 million standing army or whatever, the ability to project power into New York City and elsewhere in the United States, and with an attitude.
Sure. Let's add a third one. North Korea has nuclear bombs also, Peter Koenig. So is the U.S. biting more than it can chew with this military posturing in that part of the world? 30 seconds, please.
Yes, definitely. I would say so. And I would continue with the last statement of my colleague. The U.S. has much more. The U.S. and Europe, I have to count in Europe because they are a firm ally of the U.S. They have much more to lose with sanctions than China has to lose. We see that already with sanctioning Russia. I mean, the Europeans and the U.S., especially the Europeans, are committing suicide with these, with the economic suicide with these sanctions.
Thank you. I'm sorry, we're just fresh out of time. Peter Koenig, geopolitical analyst. Don DeBar, thank you so much, activist and commentator. And with that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. From me, Top Way and the team. It's goodbye until next time.